Tiny specks in the Indian Ocean, the Cocos Islands lie closer to Indonesia than Australia. Yet today they're Australian territory. But for almost 1.5 centuries, the Clunies-Ross dynasty ruled this paradise like feudal lords. They reigned here until just 20 years ago, when the Australian government drove the last king and his wife into exile.
I just thought we would just go on living there until we died. We'd die there. I didn't think we would ever leave. Not ever.
We didn't think it in terms of a dynasty or anything like that. It was just a fact of life.
As much as hard times have fallen on the Clunies-Rosses, they never give up. They still never give up.
This is the community the Clunies-Ross family once ruled, the local Malay population. The 600 people here are now Australian citizens. But for generations they owed their allegiance to the kings of the Cocos. The labour of their forebears built the Clunies-Ross fortune, but visitors described it as slavery. In the 1970s, the Australian media flew in to investigate.
Island rule has resulted in a remarkable combination of planned birth control, apparently no crime or industrial disputes, and a minimum of stress. The people appear content in a way which is difficult for any materialistic, ambitious Australian to understand.
But despite this, John Clunies-Ross was accused of being a tyrant.
Are you an autocrat?
No. I mean, I don't run this place on autocratic lines, if that's what you mean.
The trade that's being given you is the king of Cocos. Is that fair?
I'm the senior person here, that would be fair enough, but I certainly don't style myself king.
King or dictator, neither was acceptable to the Australian government, and a long battle began to depose Clunies-Ross. He was finally driven from his island home and now lives in modest exile in the suburbs of Perth. John Clunies-Ross is disillusioned, but not yet prepared to accept that the dynasty is finished.
Well, this term dynasty in that sort of sense doesn't mean anything. I mean, the family hasn't come to an end. I still have successors, so to speak. Young John's still on the island and loving it there and doesn't wish to be anywhere else.
Young girl!
When his father was exiled from Cocos, John Jr. and his son Jack were allowed to stay on. It wasn't made easy for them, and they're now just ordinary islanders struggling to make a living.
Oh, we have been wealthy in the past, and we've been poor in the past. Don't think money ever was a driving force for my father, and it's only grease for the wheels for me too. You can only have such a big house and so much beer you can drink.
Today, John lives in a modest house, nothing like the grand mansion he grew up in. Oceania House is the monument to a family history that began in 1825. The Cocos Islands were an uninhabited paradise in the Indian Ocean when John Clunies-Ross, a Scottish seafarer, landed here and claimed them for himself. He imported a Malay workforce, and the family started to build its fortune.
I suppose at one stage I could have said I was quite wealthy, but so what? I don't think we, any of them at any time, used their wealth just on their own personal well-being. It was helped to develop the island.
Over successive generations, the dynasty cemented its rule. Britain had claimed the islands, but allowed the Clunies-Ross family to remain in control. They intermarried with the Malay population, But Cocos remained a strictly feudal society. And when John, the last king, was growing up, it was taken for granted that he'd been born to rule.
Well, I certainly wasn't fully prepared, but I was expecting it. So I was prepared in a psychological sense, in an ability sense, not prepared because I had plenty to learn. To a large degree, the islanders in their skills taught me things. And I'm not a great fisherman, but I had to go out there until I could prove I could catch fish. I think this is something that was certainly my father instilled on me, is that the family tradition is to be a jack of all trade and a master of most of them.
Like all the Clunies-Ross men, John was sent to England for an education. It was there in 1951 that he met Daphne Parkinson. They married, and he convinced her to return with him to his island kingdom.
I remember him saying, well, you come now or you don't come at all, because there's only 2 ships a year at that time. No, it didn't worry me. Why would it? I mean, there were going to be people there. It's not like going and living in the middle of the Sahara Desert or something.
John and Daphne went on to raise a young family in a privileged and carefree world.
Idyllic. You couldn't have a better childhood. 10 acres of garden, fruit trees, younger brother to beat up, 3 sisters to beat you up. Yeah, it's ideal.
We didn't live like kings. We didn't have much furniture. We didn't have all that many clothes. We didn't wear shoes. You walked around just like ordinary people. Oh, maybe a little less like ordinary people.
And in this isolated community, John Clunies-Ross had to be all things to all people.
Mum and Dad were the doctor and dentist. He's a hypnotist at one stage. I think he cured someone of asthma by hypnotism. Set bones, done teeth, just about anything. Buried people, raised them, taught them. They're master of all trades, I'd say.
He just seemed to be into everything. Here, there and everywhere. Always teaching people things. Yeah, I suppose a sort of father figure, not a king.
In the 1950s, the family might have imagined that this ordered life would continue forever. But for the Malays, this was hard work for meagre wages. And they were paid in the Clunies-Ross plastic currency, only redeemable at the company store. Any worker who wanted to leave the islands was not allowed to return.
It was unusual kind of a setup. Like our living is not like today's life. Like we earn very little at that time, and we are only paid by plastic money.
By 1972, the conditions on Cocos were being reported in the Australian press. Australia now had sovereignty over the islands, and Andrew Peacock, the Minister for External Territories, flew into Cocos. He found that John Clunies-Ross was in no mood for change.
He took the view that Australia lacked sovereignty and that as this territory or island had been vested in his family by Queen Victoria, he was in control. Well, of course, that wasn't the case any more than any Crown grant here allowed people not to abide by laws.
The case against Clunies-Ross was mounting. A United Nations report attacked conditions. The Whitlam government then appointed Robert Linford as administrator of the Cocos. Linford and his wife Pat were sent in to sort things out.
Mr. Whitlam said, we'll have to get rid of that man. He had a personal interest somehow.
Clunies-Ross was gradually worn down. To get rid of him, the Fraser government bought his land for over $6 million. Then, in 1984, the Cocos Malays voted overwhelmingly to integrate with Australia. In the final indignity, John Clunies-Ross went bankrupt when the Hawke government boycotted his shipping company. Forced to sell his mansion, he left Cocos forever.
I'm quite sure the government did us wrong, yes. When I say the government, I mean, basically, the bureaucrats.
Today on the Cocos Islands, opinion is still divided over the rule of the man they once called king.
You know, you hear these bulldust stories about, oh, he ruled with an iron rod and all. That's a lot of claptrap, you know. I mean, the people, totally in the main, probably 90% at least, were totally happy with the situation. And quite frankly, it wasn't until the United Nations put their 2 bobs worth in that the stuff hit the fan.
Oceania House has been left to run down, but 2 decades after the departure of John Clunies-Ross, it has an unusual saviour.
I know this joint back to front. I've been under these floors. I've spent half the time up here under the floors, as much as I've spent in the ceiling. So I just about know it brick by brick, you know.
Lloyd Least was a Perth taxi driver with a lifelong fascination with the Clunies-Ross family.
This, in actual fact, was the original stairwell.
He did well in the taxi business, and when Oceania House came on the market, he snapped it up.
Over that position, and the big teak staircase, the original one, it would be their wish one day to get this joint back again, and I don't deny them that wish, you know, because I'd certainly do the same. All these ceilings are 15 foot, which is generally a foot higher than even any double-storey house in Australia.
The new lord of Oceania House can see little wrong with the rule of the previous owner.
Lounge room, this is all the original teak. He fought so long and hard with the government when the tide was turning, because he had that, although you might say a feudal situation, it worked basically well. He couldn't see why it shouldn't keep working, but in fact, he was probably not looking at good economics.
20 years have passed since John and Daphne Clunies-Ross left this house for their new life in Perth.
I don't think I'll ever get over it. I think it'll stay forever. It's difficult. Anyway, my ashes will go back there. I presume I will. Let's take my ashes back to Cocos, so I'll go back. My first child is buried there in the garden.
John and Daphne have always wanted to visit the islands one more time. Now, a family reunion has been planned on Cocos. So they're finally setting out on that journey, but returning with mixed feelings.
I'm not really looking forward to it to start with. It'll be very different, I think. Very different. I think life there is more hectic. And I don't think the people are quite as happy as they used to be. Not so carefree. No, I think it'll be very different.
There'll be mixed feelings, obviously. To see things that need to be done and not be able to do anything about them.
There was a time when John and Daphne's return would be greeted by a gathering of staff and family. This was certainly less than a regal welcome.
They're all a bit surprised there's nobody here because the plane's an hour early. Nobody here to meet it.
But then at the kampong, the local village, their former workers seemed pleased to see them.
They said, why is it taking you so long to come back? You know, where the hell have you been? And why don't we ever hear from you?
These are the same streets where the Clunies-Ross sisters, Joy and Linda, once played. Joy is also back in Cocos to share the experience with her parents.
They don't understand why our family aren't here. They have no understanding of that. They think that we have left and because my father wanted to, and that he has chosen to leave, which was not the case at all.
Okay then, well, it's been a few years since we've been here. That's something, yeah.
And finally, a return to Oceania House, the old family home.
Well, let's have a look in here.
Yes. The old
Yes.
dining room used to be the round table. We'd have a big New Year's Eve party when it was their holidays. We'd put up boat races and sometimes other kinds of competitions.
Yeah, if they had problems, they'd come to us and help sort it out. And similarly, if we did, they would.
Yeah. I very nearly delivered a baby once, didn't I? Yeah. The doctor just made it before I did it.
Oceania House once rang to the sound of Clunies-Ross children. Today, the grandchildren are only here as visitors.
There was a while when I swore that I'd burn it before it would go into someone else's hands, but Lloyd came to Ireland and he wasn't such a, I don't know, such a bad bloke, strange, but not bad bloke, and he loves the place, you know, as much as I do, so he's welcome to it while he can afford it, and you know, hopefully someone will look after it when he's gone.
I mean, he must retrace his steps every day of his life. And to think, you know, where did it go wrong? What happened? How did I come to do that?
You can't even keep up, can you?
God, it's a week's work in itself, just trying to clean the windows. And I'm not a domestic type of person, you know, I'm looking for other things to do, not, you know, sweeping and cleaning windows and that. Yeah, so how does it feel coming back after all these years?
Mixed feelings.
Yeah, I can well imagine.
I think in my father's heart he would love to live here, but it has to be made easy for him to do it.
Ain't that a monkey?
There is the opportunity there, I think, to make it right again for my father. That he could have a garden here to look after and a home here. That should be made possible and easy for him.
In the grounds of the old house are the ruins of the schoolrooms John Clunies-Ross built for the local children, and where he also taught.
Here's a sentence. Put those things there.
Today, the local school is much better off, and many of John's former pupils are now teachers.
When he saw us the other day, like first thing he was asking, are we still working at the school? And he was so happy that to see that all of his ex-students still working at the school. I think we should thank him.
The Cocos Islanders now have much to thank Australia for. The government has built new houses for everyone, modern communication and transport. But there are few jobs apart from the government service workers.
They haven't achieved the dreams that they desired of self-empowerment, and they don't even have a say in the legislation that's enforced on them. And so they are now learning to rely on themselves. The children are better educated, so much less likely to be led by the nose in a simplistic fashion anyway.
The Clunies-Ross family encouraged the Malays to practice their religion freely and never allowed Christian missionaries on the islands. Today, the locals take their faith even more seriously.
Oh yes, the big obvious change was the dress of the ladies and the girls wearing the Muslim style dress. And before they wore blouse and sarong or skirt. and heads uncovered with their hair rolled up in a bun in the back with flowers in it. I mentioned this to Alawa, who was one of the girls who used to work in the house long ago, and said, you don't wear flowers in your hair anymore? And she said, there aren't any flowers here since you left.
The people who worked for John and Daphne want to welcome them back. A dinner is prepared in their honour. In a peculiar tradition going back 150 years, Malayan dancing combines with a Scottish reel, brought to the islands by the original Clunies-Ross family.
Yes, we've had a good time back here, more, I think, than I really expected. The welcome we got when we went to Home Island and seeing the old friends there come up and greet us. But then there was a bit of sadness too, because there were old friends who are no longer there. As we saw, we went down to the graveyard and saw the new graves of people that were old-time friends.
The Scottish influence continues to resonate across 6 generations of the Clunies-Ross family. They still occupy the soil.
There's George, John sitting next to him.
John's father is buried here. So is his grandfather. Great uncles and aunts and many children who died as infants.
We used to go there as children and be glad of the history and of the ancestors. You know, it was our adventure to go and actually touch the graves. It was like touching our ancestors and being with them.
Yeah, if he was 30 years old, his parents would have been in the 60s, probably, or at least 50s.
Makes him think, well, there's going to be a time when he's going to pass on, and he might not necessarily be buried there. We'd certainly bring his ashes back if that's all we could do.
The Clunies-Ross Empire has long gone. Its end hastened as much by economics as by politics. It was built on an industry which could never sustain Australian wages and conditions.
The place had to change. However, if I were John Clunies-Ross, I would think I was hard done by as well. Because I actually think subsequent governments were too tough on him. His views belonged to a different period, and I was charged with responsibilities that belonged to another era. But, you know, as a man, he was a very decent, upright, straight. As it turned out with me, a man true to his word.
I didn't see why they had to change it. We were slowly changing it ourselves, but they just didn't like the speed we were doing it at. We were teaching people, we were bringing them more into the 20th century, but I think the politicians wanted it to happen overnight.
It's John and Daphne's last day before they return to Perth. Family and friends have gathered for a final farewell.
That's the hard thing about coming back, is leaving again, and you have to go through that process of grieving again, which you can't do too often, else it just breaks you in two. It was unnecessary, what happened, particularly to my father, and I'm always amazed and full of awe how well he's taken it. You know, I think he's just I'm a daddy's girl, but he is, to me, just so wonderful.
John Clunies-Ross can't accept that his regime was cruel or heartless. As he leaves, for possibly the last time, he remains proud of the legacy his family has given the Cocos Islands.
Leadership and care for, what, 170 years. Although people talk about me being king, it's merely more like being head of a family than being a king.
They were my grandparents, my aunts, my uncles, my sisters, my brothers, my children. You know, they were all just so nice to me, and they all taught me things like I taught them things. And to have it just taken away is not very easy.